Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. In 2006, I found myself in the heart of Alabama, out in Conecuh National Forest. It wasn't exactly a place tourists lined up to see. No scenic vistas or Instagram-worthy sunsets here, just endless stretches of pine trees, thick underbrush, and more mosquitoes than a man should have to deal with. But I wasn't there for the scenery. I was running from the noise, the clutter of life that had slowly been eating away at my sanity for the better part of a decade. My name's Owen Westrick, and back then, I had convinced myself that a little solitude in the woods would do the trick. Looking back now, I'd call that optimistic. Idiotic, more likely. I'd been in Conecuh for about 2 weeks, staying in an old hunting cabin a buddy of mine rented out to outdoorsmen like me, though I had little experience in the outdoors aside from car camping as a kid. It was just me, a few supplies, and the deep, all-consuming silence of the forest. Honestly, at first, I thought it was perfect. I could hear myself think again, and there was a strange kind of peace in the isolation. No phones, no internet. Just the rustle of the wind through the trees and the occasional rusted-out pickup truck passing by on the old logging road nearby. Then, after a few days, I noticed something. The woods weren't quiet anymore. At first, it was subtle. Maybe the birds didn't sing quite as much, or I wasn't hearing the usual animal sounds at night. But then, one evening, while I was sitting on the porch watching the sun go down through the trees, I realized I hadn't heard any wildlife all day. No squirrels scurrying around, no bugs buzzing, not even the distant calls of birds. The woods had gone completely still. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in this sort of thing, but even a city boy like me knows that's not normal. Something was off. Real off. I shook it off, thinking maybe it was just me getting spooked by the isolation. I went back inside, made myself a terrible cup of instant coffee, and settled into a worn-out armchair with one of those old Western novels I found stuffed under the bed. I tried not to think too much about it, but you know how that goes. The quieter it got outside, the louder my thoughts became, and they were all saying the same thing: leave. I should have listened. That night, I heard something big moving around in the brush just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe even a bear, though there weren't supposed to be any in these parts. But the noise, it wasn't right. The footsteps were too deliberate, too slow. They stopped just outside the cabin, right near the window next to where I was sitting. I froze. I don't own a gun. Never saw the need for one. But in that moment, I sure wished I did. I stood there, hard hammering in my chest, listening to whatever it was, just standing there, not moving, just breathing. This deep, heavy, rhythmic breathing, like a dog on a hot day, but louder, more deliberate. For a second, I thought about looking out the window, but my gut told me that was a terrible idea. So I did the only thing that made sense. I turned off the lights and waited. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and then it stopped. Silence again, but not the kind that comes from calm. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something bad happens. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wooden beams felt like a warning. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just an animal passing by, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever was out there was watching, waiting. The next morning, I packed up my gear, ready to leave. I'd had enough of the woods, and whatever had decided to stalk me through them. As I stepped outside, though, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just beyond the clearing, near the tree line, there were marks in the dirt. Deep claw marks, the kind that no animal I knew of could make. And the smell. God, that smell. Like something had died and been left out in the sun for days. I wanted to run, but something pulled me closer. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stupidity. Either way, I found myself crouching down next to those marks, examining them like I was some kind of detective. The claw marks were long and deep, too deep for any regular animal, but that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was what I found a few feet beyond the marks. It was a deer, or at least what was left of it. The thing had been ripped apart, limbs scattered, entrails strewn across the ground, and the head was missing. I stumbled back, gagging, trying not to lose the pathetic breakfast I'd scarfed down an hour earlier. I needed to get out of there fast. I grabbed my bag, threw it into the truck, and peeled out of that clearing like my life depended on it, because I'm pretty sure it did. I didn't get far. About a mile down the road, just where the logging trail met the main road, I saw something. It was standing in the middle of the road, crouched down like it was waiting for me. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its arms were too long, hanging down almost to its knees, ending in claws that looked like they could slice through bone. And its face, Jesus, that face, was somewhere between a wolf and something much, much worse. It didn't move. It just stared at me, standing there like it had all the time in the world. I slammed on the brake, skidding to a stop just a few yards away. For a second, I thought it was going to charge, rip through the windshield and tear me apart right there. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching me with a look I couldn't place. Like it was sizing me up, deciding whether I was worth the effort. Then, slowly, it turned and walked off into the trees. I didn't wait around to see where it was going. I floored it, tires screeching as I sped down the road, not stopping until I hit the nearest gas station about 20 miles out. When I got there, I stumbled out of the truck, pale, shaking, probably looking like I'd just seen a ghost. I must have looked pretty bad too, because the old guy behind the counter didn't even bat an eye when I bought a pack of cigarettes and sat down right there on the curb to light one up. I hadn't smoked in years, but that day, I needed it. I never told anyone what happened in those woods. Not until now. Part of me figured no one would believe me, and the other part, well, I wasn't sure I wanted to believe it myself. But every now and then, when I'm lying awake at night, I think back to that creature, to those claw marks in the dirt, and that deer torn to pieces, and I wonder, was it hunting me? Or was I just lucky enough to get away before it decided to make me its next meal? The thing is, though, I haven't been back to the woods since. Don't plan to either. I might have been looking for solitude out there, but what I found was something else entirely, something that I'm not eager to meet again. In the end, I figure it's like this. You can run from the noise, the people, the mess of the world, but there's always something out there, waiting. And sometimes it's much worse than anything you thought you were escaping. Of course, the dark humor in all of this? I spent years trying to get away from people, only to be reminded that sometimes monsters wear more than human skin. I never liked visiting St. Louis, not even when I was younger and more energetic. But in 2001, I found myself back in that city for reasons I'm not even sure I could justify. I had this knack for getting pulled into things I didn't want to be a part of. Name's Jarrett Holcomb, by the way, and my life's been one long string of bad decisions. This one, though, this one might top them all. St. Louis was all steel, glass, and broken promises, at least to me. People think it's all about that arch, some grand symbol of westward expansion. But if you ask me, it's more like a giant tombstone standing tall in the middle of a dead city. Anyway, I wasn't there to sightsee. I was meeting up with a guy named Colton, an old acquaintance who had a knack for getting into trouble, and of course, dragging me along with him. Colton was a gambler, but not the kind you see at poker tables. No, he gambled with things that no sane person should ever bet on. He told me about something weird happening in one of the old factories on the outskirts of town. A place that had been shut down for years. You know the type. Rusting metal, broken windows, and an air of neglect that just screams, "Don't go in here." Now, you'd think a guy like me would have learned to avoid situations like this by now, but Colton had a way of making even the worst ideas sound like they were worth a shot. So there I was, standing outside this crumbling building with him, the night air cold enough to make you question every choice that led you to this point. "You sure about this?" I asked him, knowing full well that he wasn't. Colton laughed, that stupid reckless laugh of his. Come on, Jarrett, what's life without a little risk? If I'd had a dime for every time he'd said that, I wouldn't need to worry about my mortgage anymore. Still, I followed him into the building, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the empty halls like a warning. The place stank of mildew, rust, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic. So, what exactly are we looking for? I asked, glancing around. It was dark as hell in there, and the few flashlights we brought barely cut through the gloom. Colton grinned, flashing me that look he always got right before things went sideways. Some kind of creature. People have been disappearing around here for a while now. Figured we might catch a glimpse, maybe make a little cash if we bring proof. Of course, it was about money. With Colton, it always was. We moved deeper into the factory, our footsteps crunching over broken glass and debris. The deeper we went, the colder it got, which didn't make sense because it wasn't exactly winter yet. But this cold was different. It clung to your bones, made your teeth chatter even if you were wearing a thick jacket like I was. That's when we heard it. A sound, low and distant, like metal scraping against concrete. At first I thought it was just the building settling, or maybe a piece of machinery rusting away. But the sound didn't stop. It got louder, closer. Colton's grin faded, and for once I saw something like fear flicker in his eyes. You hear that? Yeah, I muttered, gripping the flashlight tighter. What is it? He didn't answer, just nodded toward the far end of the factory where the shadows seemed even darker, like they were swallowing the weak light from our flashlights. We kept walking, each step heavier than the last, the sound of metal scraping growing louder with each one. Then, we saw it. I don't even know how to describe it, not in a way that makes sense. It was big, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, but hunched over like a wolf with muscles rippling under mangy fur. Its face, God, its face was wrong, like someone had tried to piece together different animals and failed miserably. It had a snout sort of like a dog, but the teeth were all wrong. Too long, too sharp. And then there was its body. It reminded me of a bear, if bears had longer limbs and moved with the speed of something that wasn't bound by the laws of nature. It was all sinew and muscle, built for killing. I had no idea what it was, but I could feel its eyes on me, even if I couldn't see them in the dark. Colton froze, his cocky grin completely wiped away. I've seen the guy in some bad spots, but I'd never seen him look like this. He was terrified. Move, I whispered, but he didn't. He just stood there, eyes wide, staring at the thing. And then it charged. I'm not going to lie. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding against the concrete floor, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I could hear the thing behind us, its claws scraping against the ground, getting closer. Too close. Colton, though. Colton didn't move fast enough. I heard the scream before I turned around, but by then it was too late. The creature had him. Its claws ripped into him like paper, tearing him apart in a way that no human should ever have to witness. Blood sprayed the walls, the floor, and for a second all I could think about was how much of a mess it was making. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe I thought I could help him, or maybe I was just too stunned to keep running. But I stopped and saw Colton, what was left of him, getting torn apart like a butcher going to town on a piece of meat. I should have run. Hell, I should have left town when I had the chance, but something about the way that thing looked at me, like it knew me, made me freeze. And then it stopped. It just stopped mid-rip and stared right at me, blood dripping from its mouth. I thought that was it. I thought I was next, but then it turned and vanished into the shadows like it had never been there. I stood there shaking. Colton's blood spattered across my jacket. I don't know how long I stood like that before I finally moved. Maybe a minute, maybe an hour. All I know is I grabbed what was left of Colton's flashlight and made my way out of that building, every step feeling heavier than the last. By the time I reached the street, I was covered in sweat and shaking harder than I had ever in my life. I wasn't thinking straight. All I could do was get as far away from that place as I could. The cops found me the next morning sitting on the curb outside a 7-Eleven, still covered in blood and rambling about some creature. They didn't believe me, of course. Who would? I wouldn't have believed me either, but they found Colton's body, or at least what was left of it. They pinned it on a wild animal, a bear or something. Said there was no sign of any creature like the one I described. Typical, nobody ever believes the guy covered in someone else's blood. Not until it's too late, anyway. But the weird thing? They never found the rest of Colton, just bits and pieces. Enough to know he was dead, but not enough to close the case. So I left St. Louis after that. Packed up and never looked back. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear that scraping sound. Like metal on concrete getting closer. And I can't help but wonder if it's looking for the next idiot to gamble on a bad idea. Maybe this time it'll finish the job. I never imagined I'd be running for my life in West Texas. It was 2003, and the desert was the last place I thought I'd end up. My name's Troy McClan. Not exactly the kind of guy you picture tangled up in some nightmare, but then again, none of us ever think we're the type until we are. I was just a mechanic fixing busted engines in a small town and keeping my head down. I was always content with life that way. I didn't need much, just a few beers after work, the smell of oil and grease on my hands, and the occasional poker game on the weekend. I wasn't looking for trouble. But one day, I made a stupid decision. My buddy Nate, who never could resist a gamble, talked me into going on this hunting trip near some old abandoned ranch. I should have known better. We packed up the truck, threw in our rifles, and hit the road. Nate wouldn't shut up about how we'd bagged the biggest buck this side of the Rio Grande. I wasn't really listening. In hindsight, that's the moment I should have turned around. The ranch was about 50 miles from town, isolated as all hell. There wasn't a single road sign, and the GPS signal died long before we even got close. Not that it mattered. Nate swore he knew where we were going. Typical Nate. The place was run down, nothing but old wood, rusted fences, and this creeping silence that felt unnatural. Even the wind seemed like it was holding its breath. It was hot, though, like the heat was wrapping itself around you and not letting go. The kind of heat that makes you see things that aren't there. Nate, ever the optimist, pulled out his rifle and laughed. He thought it was perfect. No people for miles. I just nodded, trying to shake off the bad feeling crawling up my spine. That ranch, though, it was the kind of place that gave you the heebie-jeebies, like it had seen things no one should see. I'd been hunting before, sure, but this was different. It didn't feel like nature. It felt like something was waiting. But Nate, well, Nate didn't believe in anything spooky. He cracked jokes the whole time we were setting up camp, especially when the sun started to dip below the horizon. "You believe in all that ghost story stuff, Troy?" he asked, grinning like an idiot. "Nope," I said, shrugging. But my eyes kept darting to the edges of the campfire where the light didn't reach. We sat there, sipping beer and laughing at our own bad luck that we hadn't seen a single animal all day. And then came the scream. It wasn't an animal, I can tell you that much. It was human, deep, blood-curdling. It froze us both. Nate shot up, his beer spilling over the ground. "Did you hear that?" he asked. But I didn't need to answer. The scream came again, louder, closer. "Let's go check it out," Nate said, grabbing his rifle like that was going to solve whatever the hell was out there. I wasn't eager, but Nate had that look in his eyes, the one that said he wasn't taking no for an answer. So we went, pushing through the dry brush, rifles drawn. The further we walked, the darker it got, and the more I regretted coming here in the first place. The ranch's old windmill creaked in the distance, spinning like a broken clock. We found the source of the scream sooner than I'd hoped. An old shack, half buried in the dirt and hidden by a mess of cacti. The door was cracked open, swinging lightly in the breeze, and from inside, something moved. I should have run, but Nate was curious. He stepped forward and nudged the door open with his rifle. Inside, the smell hit us like a punch to the face. Rot, decay, something worse. And then I saw it. A man, or what was left of him. His body was mangled, his chest torn open, and blood had soaked into the dirt beneath him. Nate gagged. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, backing away. I stood frozen, staring at the body. I didn't need to be a doctor to know this wasn't the work of any animal. Whatever did this had teeth, but they weren't normal. They were too big, too sharp, like something from a nightmare. Before I could process what the hell was going on, there was movement behind us. Fast. Something burst out of the brush, too quick for us to react. Nate fired off a shot into the dark, but I knew it missed. I heard a snarl, not an animal, but close enough to set my nerves on fire, and Nate was tackled to the ground. I whipped around just in time to see it. Something huge, hairy like a man but not. Its limbs were twisted, long, and its mouth... Jesus, the mouth was wrong. Too wide, filled with jagged, broken teeth that didn't fit. It tore into Nate before I could even blink, ripping flesh, spilling blood everywhere. I stood there, useless, watching my friend being ripped apart like a rag doll. Panic took over and I ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't even fire a shot. I just ran, crashing through the desert like a madman. The air was thick with the stench of blood and sweat. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from it. Whatever the hell it was. I heard Nate scream, once, a horrible gurgling sound that ended with a wet snap. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I didn't stop running until I hit the truck, my lungs burning, my legs ready to give out. But the keys... Nate had them. I slammed my fist into the hood, cursing under my breath. I was stuck, miles from anywhere, with nothing but darkness around me, and something inhuman out there, hunting me. I dove into the back of the truck, fumbling for my phone. No signal. Of course. No signal in the middle of nowhere. I had one last hope. Nate's rifle, left in the dirt near where I dragged him. I needed that gun, but that meant going back. I glanced around, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was gone, that it wasn't waiting for me. The noise of dry brush cracking behind me said otherwise. It charged from the darkness, that twisted, snarling thing that had killed Nate. Its silhouette was monstrous, limbs too long, body hunched like it didn't belong in this world. I grabbed a wrench from the toolbox, useless against something like that, but it was all I had. It lunged at me, and I swung as hard as I could, connecting with its jaw. The wrench barely slowed it down. I scrambled backward, my foot catching on the truck's rear bumper. It swiped at me with a clawed hand, missing by inches. I could smell its breath, hot and rancid, like meat left out in the sun for days. I kicked at it, and for a brief moment I saw hesitation in its movement, like it wasn't used to prey fighting back. That was enough for me. I took my chance, rolling out from under its grasp and making a break for the rifle. It was heavy in my hands, the cold metal giving me a sense of control, no matter how false it was. I aimed, fingers trembling, and fired. The first shot went wide, but the second hit. I didn't wait to see what kind of damage it had done. I fired again and again until I was out of rounds, until my ears rang from the sound, and the desert air smelled like gunpowder. It dropped. The creature, whatever it was, lay still, its body twitching, but it wasn't getting back up. I stood there, breathing hard, watching as it bled out into the dirt. I didn't bother with the body. I didn't care what it was or where it had come from. Nate was gone, and there wasn't any bringing him back. I found the keys in the dirt where Nate had dropped them, climbed into the truck and floored it. The headlights carved a path through the dark as I sped away, my mind numb. I wasn't about to stick around and wait for something worse. I didn't stop until I was back in town, pulling up to the sheriff's office, covered in sweat and dust. I gave my statement, told them about the ranch, the shack, and the thing that killed Nate. They didn't believe me, of course. They said I was probably just scared and panicked, that it was a mountain lion or some other animal. I didn't argue. What was the point? A few days later, they found what was left of Nate, torn to pieces just like I'd said. But no one ever found the creature. Guess that makes me the last one to see it. Hell of a hunting trip, huh? I was driving west on Route 12, heading for what I thought would be an uneventful weekend. It was 2003, and I had just left my job as a mechanic in Chicago after years of greasy hands, oil stains, and endless noise. The open road felt like a blessing. I needed silence, maybe a little fishing, and definitely some space away from my ex-girlfriend's endless texts about fixing her car. The sign read, Bourbon, Missouri, 5 miles. but I wasn't planning on stopping there. My destination was a tiny, tucked-away cabin I'd rented near the Mark Twain National Forest. I've always liked secluded places, and this one promised to be exactly that. No cell service, no people. Just me, a bottle of whiskey, and the quiet. My name's Hank Jarrett. If you've never heard of me, that's fine. Most people haven't, and I've always preferred it that way. I've spent my life fixing cars and trying not to get into too much trouble. You know, the kind of guy who prefers solving problems with a wrench rather than talking them through. At least, that was the plan until today. As I pulled off the highway onto a dirt road, my truck's tires crunched on the gravel, sending dust clouds swirling in the rearview mirror. A few miles later, I found the cabin. A worn-down place nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees. The kind of place no one's been to in years, but that's what I liked about it. Besides, it was cheap. I parked my truck and stretched out, feeling the weight of city life melt away in the cool, damp air. The forest was dense, the trees packed so close together they looked like they'd block out the sun if you stared too long. Not a single sound except for the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. Perfect. The cabin itself wasn't much. Wood logs stacked haphazardly, a tin roof that had definitely seen better days, and windows so grimy they might as well have been painted black. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and I was greeted by a wave of musty air. The inside was sparse, a small table, one chair, a fireplace, and a bed that looked like it could have been older than the forest itself. As I unpacked, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. It wasn't the cabin. It was exactly the kind of place I'd expected. It was the forest. It felt too still, too quiet. And every so often I'd get this weird feeling like I was being watched. Now, I'm not the paranoid type, but years of working in shady parts of Chicago had given me a gut instinct that I'd learned to trust. I brushed it off, chalking it up to first-day jitters. Nothing more. By nightfall, I had a small fire going in the fireplace. I sat down with my whiskey, took a long sip, and let out a sigh. This was what I'd come here for. No noise, no responsibilities, just a little peace. But as the fire crackled, that uneasy feeling returned. It started with the silence again. No crickets, no wind, just nothing. I put the bottle down and got up to look out the window. The trees swayed slightly, but the stillness felt unnatural. My gut was telling me something wasn't right, and this time I couldn't ignore it. Then I saw it. Just a flicker at first, a shadow moving between the trees. Could have been an animal, but I'd been around enough wildlife to know this wasn't a deer or a raccoon. Whatever it was, it moved too fast, too smooth. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The night was pitch black and the beam from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. But then I caught a glimpse of something big, moving about 30 feet away in the tree line. My pulse quickened, but I held my ground. The figure stopped. It stood there, completely still, as if waiting for me to make a move. For a moment, I wondered if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it stepped forward, into the beam of my light. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Its skin was rough, almost like bark, and its limbs were long and twisted, too long to be human. Its head was hunched, and its mouth hung open in a twisted snarl, showing teeth that looked far too sharp for something that size. I couldn't compare it to any animal I knew. It was like someone had taken a wolf and stretched it beyond reason. I'm not a hero, not by any stretch of the imagination. My first instinct was to back up, slowly, and get inside the cabin, but as soon as I moved, so did it. Fast. Too fast. I slammed the door shut and locked it, but I could hear it outside, scraping against the wood like it was testing the walls. My breath was ragged, and the sound of my heartbeat pounded in my ears. The thing outside wasn't going away. I could hear its low, guttural rasp like a person trying to breathe through a broken throat. Then the banging started. Loud, hard thuds against the walls. It wanted in. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a rusted hunting knife I'd found in one of the cabin drawers, and backed up against the far wall. I knew this wouldn't end well. The banging grew louder. It sounded like the walls would give in at any moment. In the back of my mind, I thought about how no one would ever find me out here. No one even knew I was here. Great, Hank, I thought. This is how you end. Alone in the middle of nowhere, torn apart by something out of a nightmare. And just as I thought the door would splinter, everything stopped. The banging, the scraping, it all went silent again. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. I waited. Minutes passed. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had lost interest. But then I heard a faint noise, like someone or something moving inside the cabin. I turned, and standing at the edge of the shadows right by the fireplace was the creature. It had found a way in. Its twisted limbs seemed to defy the angles a body could make as it stalked forward. My knife was useless, I knew that. But I held it up anyway, like some desperate idiot clinging to his last shred of hope. The thing stopped, sniffing the air, and for a brief moment it almost seemed curious. Then, without warning, it lunged. I won't lie and tell you I fought it off heroically. I didn't. The thing was on me faster than I could react, its teeth ripping into my arm as I screamed in pain. The knife fell from my hand, clattering to the floor. I tried to kick it, punch it, anything to get it off me, but it was too strong. Its claws dug into my side and I felt the warmth of my own blood soaking through my shirt. Just when I thought it was over, when I was ready to accept that this thing was going to kill me, a loud crack echoed through the cabin. The thing reared back, screeching in pain. Another crack and it stumbled, blood spurting from a fresh wound in its side. Someone had shot it. Through the haze of pain and confusion I saw him, an old man, rifle in hand, standing at the cabin door. He fired again and the creature howled before collapsing to the floor. "Get out!" the old man grunted, motioning to me with his rifle. I didn't argue. I staggered to my feet, clutching my bleeding arm, and followed him outside. We didn't stop until we were deep in the woods, far enough that the cabin was just a distant memory. The old man finally spoke. "That thing's been here for years. Kills anything that wanders too close." I didn't have the strength to ask questions. All I could think about was the cabin, the thing lying dead inside it. Or at least I hoped it was dead. The old man left me at a nearby town hospital. They stitched me up, gave me painkillers, and told me I was lucky to be alive. But they didn't know the half of it. No one would believe what happened, and I wasn't about to try explaining it. As I sit here now, I wonder if that old man knew more than he let on. There's no way something like that just exists without people knowing. Maybe he's part of something bigger, something keeping those woods quiet for a reason. All I know is I won't be going back there. I've always been a city person. The constant hum of traffic, the glow of street lights, and the comforting anonymity of urban life. These were the things I knew and loved. But a few times a year I'd feel this inexplicable urge to get away from it all. Not your typical beach vacation or resort getaway, mind you. I'm talking about disappearing into the wilderness, finding some secluded cabin rental, and spending a week completely off the grid. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if those trips were some kind of twisted fate. Was I unknowingly drawn to something out there in the dark, or was it drawn to me? These questions have haunted me ever since that fateful week in the Ozarks, a trip that would forever change my perception of reality, and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was late October, about 3 years ago. I had just wrapped up a grueling project at work, and the need to escape was stronger than ever. I spent hours poring over rental listings, searching for something truly remote. That's when I stumbled upon it, a converted fire tower deep in the Mark Twain National Forest, right in the heart of Missouri's Ozark Mountains. The listing promised complete solitude, a 360-degree view of the surrounding wilderness, and absolutely no modern amenities beyond the bare essentials. It was perfect. I booked it immediately, requested time off work, and started planning my trip with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. The drive from St. Louis took nearly 4 hours, the last hour of which was on winding back roads that seemed to get narrower and more overgrown with each passing mile. My phone lost signal about 45 minutes before I reached my destination, and I found myself relying solely on the printed directions the owner had provided. As I navigated the final stretch of gravel road, The dense forest suddenly gave way to a small clearing, and there it was, my home for the next week. The fire tower stood about 60 feet tall, a weathered wooden structure that looked like it had been there for decades. A narrow staircase zigzagged up its side, leading to a small cabin perched at the top. I parked my car and took a moment to stretch, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The silence was almost overwhelming after hours of highway noise. No cars, no planes overhead, not even the distant bark of a dog. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a bird I couldn't identify. Grabbing my backpack and a couple of supply boxes, I made my way up the stairs. Each step creaked under my weight, and I found myself gripping the railing a little tighter as I climbed higher. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs were burning, and I was slightly out of breath. Note to self: city life hasn't been kind to my fitness level. The cabin itself was simple but cozy. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, complete with a propane stove and a cooler that served as a makeshift refrigerator. A narrow bed was tucked against the opposite wall, and a rickety table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. But the real star of the show was the view. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire cabin, offering an unobstructed panorama of the surrounding Ozark wilderness. Rolling hills covered in a patchwork of autumn colors stretched as far as the eye could see. In the distance, I could make out the silvery ribbon of a river winding its way through the valley. As I unpacked and settled in, I felt the tension of the past few months begin to melt away. This was exactly what I needed. No emails, no phone calls, no deadlines. Just me, my books, and the great outdoors. The sun was setting by the time I finished organizing my supplies. I grabbed a beer from the cooler and stepped out onto the small balcony that wrapped around the cabin. The view was, in a word, breathtaking. The fading sunlight painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the landscape below. But as I stood there, taking in the beauty of it all, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. It was subtle at first, just a vague sense of unease. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the natural apprehension of being alone in an unfamiliar place. Yet as the light continued to fade and the shadows deepened, the feeling only intensified. It was a sensation I'd never experienced before. A heaviness in the air, a prickling at the back of my neck. I felt watched. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any explanation for this irrational fear that was slowly taking hold. But there was nothing, just the gentle swaying of branches in the evening breeze. I shook my head, trying to clear these thoughts. Get it together, I muttered to myself. You're just not used to being this isolated. It's perfectly normal to feel a little on edge. Forcing myself to relax, I finished my beer and headed back inside. I heated up a simple dinner of canned soup and settled in with one of the books I'd brought along. But even as I tried to lose myself in the pages, I couldn't help glancing up at the windows every few minutes, peering into the darkness beyond. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every creak of the tower in the wind, every rustle from the forest below had me jolting awake. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with shapeless shadows and glowing eyes watching me from just beyond the firelight. I awoke the next morning feeling groggy and unrested. The early morning sun was streaming through the windows, and I could hear birds chirping cheerfully outside. In the light of day, my fears from the previous evening seemed silly and overblown. I chalked it up to first night jitters and resolved to make the most of my day. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, I decided to explore the area around the tower. There was a trail map pinned to the wall, showing a network of hiking paths crisscrossing the surrounding hills. One trail in particular caught my eye. It led to the top of a nearby ridge that promised even more spectacular views of the valley. I packed a small day pack with water, some snacks, and a first aid kit. As an afterthought, I also grabbed the can of bear spray I'd brought along. Better safe than sorry, right? With one last glance at the map, I headed down the tower stairs and set off into the woods. The trail started off easy enough, winding through stands of oak and hickory trees. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves, creating a satisfying crunch beneath my boots with each step. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of decaying vegetation, that distinct autumn smell that always filled me with a sense of nostalgia. As I hiked, I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the trail. The paranoia from the night before faded away, replaced by a growing appreciation for the natural beauty surrounding me. I stopped occasionally to examine interesting plants or rock formations, snapping photos with my camera to document the journey. It was during one of these stops, about an hour into my hike, that I first noticed something off. I had paused to retie my bootlace when a flash of movement caught my eye. It was just at the edge of my peripheral vision, gone almost as soon as I registered it. I straightened up quickly, scanning the trees around me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Probably just a deer, I murmured, trying to convince myself. But the uneasy feeling from the night before had returned, settling like a cold weight in my stomach. I pressed on, but now I found myself hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every snapping twig or rustling bush had me whipping my head around, searching for the source. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, I began to notice other things. There were broken branches along the trail, snapped at a height that seemed too tall for a deer. In a few places, I spotted tufts of coarse, dark fur caught on thorny bushes. And then there was the smell, a musky animal odor that reminded me of a poorly maintained zoo enclosure. It would hit me in waves, growing stronger in some areas before fading away again. By the time I reached the base of the final climb to the ridge, my nerves were thoroughly frayed. The rational part of my brain kept insisting that there was a perfectly logical explanation for everything I'd seen and smelled. But another part, a more primal instinct, was screaming at me to turn back, to get as far away from this place as possible. I stood there for several long moments, debating whether to continue or head back to the relative safety of the fire tower. In the end, stubbornness won out. I'd come this far, and I was determined to see the view from the top of the ridge. Besides, whatever was out here, if there even was anything, surely wouldn't approach me in broad daylight, right? The final ascent was steep and challenging, requiring me to scramble over boulders and pull myself up using exposed tree roots in some places. By the time I reached the summit, my shirt was soaked with sweat and my legs were trembling from exertion. But oh, that view! It was even more spectacular than I had imagined. From this vantage point, I could see for miles in every direction. The Ozark Mountains rolled away to the horizon, a sea of reds, oranges, and golds punctuated by the occasional evergreen. Far below, I could make out the glint of sunlight on water, probably the same river I'd spotted from the fire tower. I found a flat rock to sit on and pulled out my water bottle and a granola bar. As I sat there, catching my breath and taking in the breathtaking scenery, I felt my earlier fears begin to dissipate. How could I be afraid in a place of such incredible beauty? But then I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape moving in the valley far below, barely distinguishable from the shadows cast by the late afternoon sun. I might not have even noticed it if not for the way it moved, in a bounding, loping gait that was unlike any animal I'd ever seen. I fumbled for my camera, zooming in as far as the lens would allow. Through the viewfinder, I could make out more details, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine. The creature was massive, easily the size of a bear, but its proportions were all wrong. It seemed to shift between moving on all fours and rising up on two legs, its movements fluid and unnaturally quick for something of its size. As I watched, frozen in a mix of fascination and terror, the creature paused, and then, with a deliberate slowness that made my blood run cold, it turned its head and looked directly up at me. Even from this distance I could see its eyes, two pinpricks of reflected light that seemed to bore into my very soul. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this thing, whatever it was aware of me. Had been aware of me perhaps since the moment I'd entered its territory. The spell was broken by the sound of my camera clattering to the ground. I hadn't even realized I'd dropped it. That small noise was enough to snap me back to reality, and suddenly the only thought in my mind was escape. I scrambled to my feet, leaving my backpack and camera behind in my haste. The sun was now dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. How long had I been sitting there, transfixed by that thing? I'd lost all track of time, and now I was facing a treacherous descent in rapidly fading light. I half ran, half slid down the steep trail, my hands and knees getting scraped and bruised as I stumbled over rocks and roots. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me convinced that the creature was right behind me, ready to pounce at any moment. About halfway down I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that bypassed all rational thought and struck directly at the most primitive part of my brain. "Run," it said. "Run or die." I don't remember much of the rest of that descent. It's all a blur of panic and adrenaline, of branches whipping at my face, and the constant, overwhelming certainty that I was being pursued. At some point I veered off the main trail, crashing blindly through the underbrush in what I hoped was the general direction of the fire tower. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst into a small clearing. There, looming out of the gathering darkness, was an old shed. Without a second thought, I yanked open the weathered door and threw myself inside, pulling it shut behind me. The interior of the shed was pitch black and smelled of mold and decay. I huddled in a corner, trying to quiet my ragged breathing as I strained to listen for any sound of pursuit. Minutes ticked by, then hours. The temperature dropped, and I began to shiver uncontrollably, both from cold and residual fear. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the cracks in the shed's walls. My whole body ached and my mouth was parched with thirst. But I was alive. With trembling hands, I eased the shed door open and peered outside. The forest looked peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of the terror from the night before. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I oriented myself using the position of the sun and set off at a brisk pace in what I hoped was the direction of the fire tower. It took nearly 2 hours of walking before I finally spotted the familiar silhouette of the tower through the trees. I've never been so relieved to see anything in my life. I practically ran the last 100 yards, taking the stairs two at a time despite my exhaustion. Once inside, I locked the door, pulled down all the blinds, and collapsed onto the bed. I wanted nothing more than to sleep for days, to pretend that none of this had happened. But I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever was out there in those woods, it knew where I was, and I had no intention of being here when night fell again. I packed my belongings in record time, leaving behind anything non-essential to speed up my departure. As I was doing a final sweep of the cabin, my eyes fell on the trail map pinned to the wall. On an impulse, I tore it down and stuffed it into my pocket. I'm not sure why. Maybe as proof that this place was real, that I hadn't imagined it all. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I didn't truly relax until I saw the Welcome to St. Louis sign. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me, awareness of something that I was never meant to know existed. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a bear, I told myself, or some kind of large wolf. The human mind can play tricks, especially in unfamiliar and stressful situations. But deep down, I knew these explanations were lies I was telling myself to maintain my sanity. I couldn't resist the urge to dig deeper. I spent hours online searching for any information about strange sightings or encounters in the Ozarks. Most of what I found was clearly exaggerated folklore or outright hoaxes. But buried in old newspaper archives and obscure forums, I started to see a pattern. There were reports stretching back decades of hikers and campers going missing in that area. Most were written off as tragic accidents, people getting lost or falling victim to the harsh terrain. But some accounts mentioned strange noises in the night, unexplained tracks, and a pervasive feeling of being watched. One story in particular caught my attention. It was from a local paper, dated just a few weeks after my own encounter. A body had been found in the woods, not far from where I'd stayed. The article was light on details, but it mentioned that the victim had been torn to shreds by an unknown animal. The authorities were baffled, saying the wounds didn't match any known predator in the area. As I read account after account, a name kept coming up in hushed whispers and cautious speculation: the Ozark Howler. According to local legend, it was some kind of wolf-like creature that had been haunting the hills for generations. Most dismissed it as a campfire story, a way to explain the inexplicable sounds and sights of the deep woods. But I knew better. What I'd seen was no legend, no trick of the light or overactive imagination. It was real, and it was still out there. I tried to put it all behind me to go back to my normal life. For a while it seemed to work. I threw myself into my job, started going out more, doing anything to keep my mind occupied. But the memories of that night in the Ozark KS never truly faded. They lingered at the edges of my consciousness, creeping into my dreams and coloring my perception of the world around me. Months passed, and I started to feel like I was finally regaining some semblance of normalcy. I still avoided camping or hiking, but I could at least walk through the park without constantly looking over my shoulder. I even started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I had blown the whole incident out of proportion. That illusion of safety was shattered one crisp autumn night, almost exactly a year after my encounter in the Ozarks. I was working late, the office long since emptied of my coworkers. As I gathered my things to leave, I glanced out the window of my 10th floor office. The city sprawled out below, a sea of twinkling lights and shadowy skyscrapers. It was a view I'd seen 1,000 times before, but something about it made me pause. There, on the roof of the building across the street, was a dark shape. At first I thought it might be a maintenance worker or perhaps some equipment I'd never noticed before. But then it moved. My blood ran cold as I watched the creature lope across the rooftop with that same unnatural gait I remembered from the forest. It paused at the edge of the building, and even from this distance, I could see the gleam of its eyes as it turned to look directly at me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not in the middle of the city. I was safe here, wasn't I? With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. But what could I say? That I'd seen a monster on a rooftop? They'd think I was crazy or drunk. I ended the call before it connected and instead snapped a quick picture through the window. The image was blurry and dark, but I could just make out a vague shape on the distant rooftop. I practically ran to my car, constantly checking over my shoulder. The drive home was a nightmare of paranoia, every shadow and movement in my periphery setting my nerves on edge. Once home, I locked every door and window, drew all the curtains, and huddled on my couch with all the lights on. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the night researching, trying to find any explanation for what I'd seen. That's when I stumbled upon an obscure cryptozoology forum. Most of the posts were the usual Bigfoot and Loch Ness monster theories, but buried in the archives was a thread about the Ozark Howler. As I read through the accounts, my blood ran cold. Several people claimed to have encountered the creature far from its usual hunting grounds. There were reports from Kansas City, from Chicago, even one from as far as Detroit. All described the same thing. A large, wolf-like creature spotted in urban areas, always at night, always watching. One post in particular caught my attention. The user, who went by the handle Ozark Survivor, claimed to have had an encounter similar to mine. They too had seen the creature first in the woods, then later in their home city. But their story didn't end there. According to Ozark Survivor, the creature had continued to stalk them. It would appear sporadically, always just at the edge of perception. Sometimes on distant rooftops, sometimes in shadowy alleys, once even on the balcony of their high-rise apartment. The post ended abruptly with no further updates from the user. As dawn broke, I was still on the forum, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. The rational part of my brain insisted that it was all nonsense, just urban legends and overactive imaginations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth hidden in these stories. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with researching the Ozark Howler and similar cryptid sightings. I started carrying a high-quality camera with me everywhere, hoping to capture proof if I saw the creature again. I installed security cameras around my apartment and found myself checking the footage compulsively. My work began to suffer. I was constantly exhausted, jumping at every shadow. Friends started to comment on my appearance, asking if everything was okay. I brushed off their concerns, unable to explain the terror that had taken over my life. Then, about a month after the rooftop sighting, it happened again. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I'd hoped never to hear again. That low, rumbling growl that bypassed all rational thought and struck terror into the deepest part of my being. With a trembling hand, I reached for the bedside lamp. As light flooded the room, I saw it. There, on my 10th floor balcony, was the creature. It was pressed against the glass door, its massive form blocking out the city lights behind it. I could see it clearly now, in a way I never had before. Its body was a mass of corded muscle covered in thick dark fur. Its head was wolf-like, but the proportions were all wrong. The snout too long, the eyes too intelligent. Those eyes. They stared at me with an awareness that was terrifyingly human. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I was frozen in my bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature just watched me, its hot breath fogging the glass. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one massive paw and placed it against the balcony door. The glass creaked under the pressure, and I saw hairline cracks begin to spread from beneath its claws. That was enough to break me from my paralysis. I lunged for my phone, fumbling to unlock it and open the camera app. But by the time I looked back up, the balcony was empty. The creature had vanished as silently as it had appeared, leaving behind only the cracked glass and a lingering sense of dread. The photo I managed to take showed nothing but an empty balcony. The only evidence of my encounter was the damaged door, and even that could be explained away by natural causes. A stress fracture in the glass, perhaps, or damage from a hailstorm I didn't remember. In the days that followed, I barely slept. I spent my nights huddled in my living room, all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the building settling. During the day, I wandered through life in a haze of exhaustion and fear. I knew I couldn't go on like this. The creature, whatever it was, had followed me home. It knew where I lived, and it was toying with me. Each appearance felt like a message. You can't escape. I'm always watching. In desperation, I reached out to Ozark Survivor through the forum. To my surprise, I received a response almost immediately. The message was brief, but it chilled me to my core. It won't stop. It never stops. The only way out is to go back, face it where it all began. I knew what I had to do. A week later, I found myself driving back into the Ozarks. I had taken a leave of absence from work, citing mental health reasons. It wasn't far from the truth. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a breakdown. This time I came prepared. I had camping gear, emergency supplies, and a high-powered rifle I'd purchased specifically for this trip. I didn't know if it would be effective against the creature, but it made me feel a little less helpless. I set up camp near the fire tower where my nightmare had begun a year ago. As night fell, I built a large fire and waited. Part of me hoped that nothing would happen, that I'd spend a quiet night in the woods and return home, writing off my experiences as an extended stress-induced hallucination. But as the moon rose over the trees, I heard it. That familiar growl, closer than ever before. I gripped my rifle tightly, my palms sweaty despite the cool night air. It emerged from the shadows at the edge of my campsite. In the flickering firelight, it looked even more terrifying than I remembered. Its eyes reflected the flames, giving them a hellish glow. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could feel its gaze boring into me, filled with an intelligence that seemed impossible for a mere animal. Slowly, I raised my rifle. The creature didn't move. It just watched me, almost seeming curious. And in that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. It wasn't hunting me. It never had been. This creature, this impossibility, was studying me. Just as I had been fascinated by it, venturing into its territory out of a desire to unplug and experience something beyond my normal life, it had become fascinated by me. It had followed me back to the city not out of malice, but out of a desire to understand. I lowered my rifle, my hands shaking. "What are you?" I whispered. The creature tilted its head almost quizzically. Then, to my utter astonishment, it sat back on its haunches, much like a dog might. But the intelligence in its eyes was anything but canine. Slowly, cautiously, I sank down to sit by my fire. The creature remained where it was, just watching. And so we stayed, human and monster, regarding each other across the flames. I'd like to say that this realization solved everything, that the creature and I came to some sort of understanding, that my fear vanished and was replaced by wonder, but that would be a lie. The truth is, I spent that entire night in a state of hyper-alertness, my hand never far from my rifle. When dawn finally broke, the creature slunk back into the forest, leaving me alone and exhausted. I packed up my camp with shaking hands and drove home. In the days and weeks that followed, I grappled with what had happened. I never saw the creature in the city again, but I could never shake the feeling of being watched. I've spent the years since then trying to understand what happened to me. I've reached out to cryptozoologists, to folklorists, even to a few open-minded biologists. Most dismiss my story outright. A few listen with interest but can offer no explanations. I've returned to the Ozarks a few times since then. I never see the creature directly, but sometimes in the deepest parts of the night, I hear that growl in the distance. And I know it's out there, watching, learning. I don't know what the Ozark Howler is. The undiscovered species, some kind of paranormal entity, a government experiment gone wrong. I have theories, but no real answers. What I do know is this: there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk at the edges of our reality, challenging everything we think we know about the natural world. And sometimes when we venture into the wilderness seeking to unplug from our modern lives, we attract the attention of these things. So the next time you're in the woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, well, maybe you are. And maybe, just maybe, the watcher is as curious about you as you are about it. Just be careful. Not all curiosity is benign, and some things once seen can never be unseen.